I think it's also a little bit misleading to think of the United States as having a murder rate. About 75% of the murders in the United States take place in about 3% of the counties. About 70% of the counties in the United States have 0 murders. If you look at all countries around the world, you find that countries with higher gun ownership rates tend to have lower homicide rates. And if you look at all the other developed countries other than the United States, across those countries, more gun ownership is associated with lower homicide rates. If you want to look at countries that have both, let's say, low gun ownership and high homicide rates, there are lots of countries like that. You have Russia, for example, which has a homicide rate that's about 4 times higher than what we have here in the United States. And yet, guns are effectively banned. You have Brazil, which has a gun ownership rate of maybe about 2%, which regularly has a homicide rate that's about 5 times, 6 times higher than what we have in the United States. You look other countries like Switzerland, for example, has traditionally had one of the lowest homicide rates in Europe, and yet they have gun ownership rates that are similar to or higher than what we have here. Israel, which probably has one of the lower homicide rates in the world, has gun possession rates. The government technically owns the gun, but people can go and possess the guns for decades, so effectively they own it. And very widespread gun ownership. You have about 15% of the adult population in Israel that has permits to be able to carry guns with them, which is about 3 times higher than the gun carrying rate that we have here in the United States. A lot of the mass public shootings in Europe or around the world simply don't get attention. I mean, if you look at the worst K through 12 school shootings, 3 of the 4 of them have occurred in Europe. 2 of them have occurred in Germany. You have a lot of mass public shootings in France, even before the 4 big ones that you had last year, and Finland. There's been a number of them. If you look at the European Union, during the first 7 years of the Obama administration, and you use the FBI definition of mass public shootings, which are 4 or more people killed in a public place, not involving gang violence against each other or some other crime like a robbery, what you find is that the European Union had 25 mass public shootings. That's the same number that occurred in the United States. And if you look at the casualty rates for mass public shootings per capita, because you have to adjust for population, their casualty rate per capita is actually 50% higher for mass public shootings than what we have in the United States. France and the United States had 4 mass public shootings last year. The total casualties, killings plus injuries from mass public shootings in France had 532 casualties. In the United States, during the first 7 years of the Obama administration, there were 396 casualties. So France had a country 1/5 the population of the United States had more casualties in 1 year than the United States had during the entire first 7 years of the Obama presidency. Canada does have some mass public shootings. It's a relatively low rate compared to a lot of countries. But Canada doesn't have as strict gun control laws as a lot of Europe. Most of Europe has much stricter gun control laws than you have in Canada. And yet, they have higher mass public shooting rates, either the frequency or the fatalities or the injuries. One thing that people don't understand is how much differences in murder rates have nothing to do with police or with gun control. It's just cultural differences that you can have. So for example, you look at someplace like the UK. Before they had any gun control laws, the first gun control laws that you had in the UK were 1920. You'd find years where you'd have, like London, a city of over 8 million people, that you'd have 2 gun murders. Gun ownership extremely common. Probably the best way to look at crime is not to look across countries, purely cross-sectional data. A lot of people will compare the United States to the UK, for example, and they'll say the UK has very strict gun control, has very low gun ownership, and has a low homicide rate. And so they'll say that it must be the fact that they have the strict gun control. I would argue that they have a low homicide rate despite the fact that they have strict gun control. When they banned handguns in January '97, they actually found in the next 8 years that their homicide rate went up by about 50%. It only started to fall after that, after they had about an 18% increase in the number of police officers. It's important to state that guns make it easier for people to kill other people, but they also make it easier for people to protect themselves and prevent people from being killed. And the question, what's the net effect? And what you find is that people use guns much more frequently to stop crime than they are to commit them. Anybody who reads my research knows that I think police are extremely important in reducing crime. I think police are the single most important factor. But if you look at surveys of police in the United States, they're probably the strongest supporters of private gun ownership of any group, because they realize that while they are important, they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. And one interesting thing to look at across countries or even across states in the United States is the rate at which burglars break into homes while the residents are in the dwellings. For the United States as a whole, it's about 13%. A country like the UK, for example, 60%. The UK has a burglary rate about twice as high as the United States. And surveys are done of burglars by different think tanks and organizations in both countries, as well as other countries around the world. And what you find is that American burglars seem to spend about twice as long casing a home before they break in compared to their British counterparts. And the number one reason why they spend so much time trying to make sure nobody's in the home before they break in is that they're worried about getting shot. Some states have passed laws requiring that people have to lock up their guns. You see right when those laws get passed, burglars become more likely to break into the home while the residents are there, and they're also more successful in committing their crimes. You see actually an increase in total deaths, rapes, robberies, after laws requiring that people have to lock up their guns. There's basically two groups of people who benefit the most from gun ownership. You have people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly, and you have people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime, and that tends to be poor, overwhelmingly poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. President Obama, for example, after each of the mass public shootings, the one law that he's called for every single time has been background checks on private transfers of guns. You look at all the research that's been done by criminologists or economists, and you just don't find support for the notion that having background checks reduces any type of violent crime rate. And there's a simple reason for that, and that is, just as people can go and get illegal drugs, which is very difficult to stop people from doing, simply saying, well, if we ban drugs, people won't get them. The same thing is true with guns. In fact, the very sources for guns in the United States are the same sources that you have for illegal drugs. If tomorrow I could click my fingers and cause all illegal drugs to disappear from the United States and all guns, I mean, how long do you think it would be before illegal drugs started coming back into the United States? If you're at the border, 20 minutes, a half hour, something like that. How long do you think it would take for the drug gangs to bring in guns to protect that valuable property? They'd bring them at the same time. It's not like a drug gang can go to the police and say, this other gang stole our drugs. Can you help us go and get them back? The drug gangs have to set up essentially their own militaries in order to go and protect that extremely valuable property that they have. And the bottom line is that the same people that supply illegal drugs are the same ones that go and sell guns to people.